In 1949, Joseph Campbell, an up-and-coming author with a curiosity for the writings of myth, published his first solo work, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Campbell had a very simple goal in mind when he authored this work, to offer a sort of instruction on how to read myth, or, more accurately, provide his assessment of the monomyth, as he called it. You see, The Hero with a Thousand Faces spawned a structure which many modern writers reference today, that being what we all know as the hero's journey. Campbell never actually used this name when referring to the structure, but it has become synonymous with it instead through word of mouth. So of course, if myth spawned a structure that many writers strive to follow, how good is this structure? And of course, how did it change, if at all? Well, let's start by answering the most important question. What is the hero's journey? The hero's journey is a story told in 3 acts. In the first act, our protagonist, or the hero, begins in the ordinary world. Granted, their life doesn't exactly need to be ordinary, per se, but they are surrounded by familiar territory. Think of Jason's non-ordinary beginning. Having had his father's throne usurped by his uncle, he is taken away to be raised and trained by Chiron, starting his journey in a world that is unordinary by our standard, but all the hero really knows at the time. The hero is then called to adventure, often by some supernatural or divine force, or possibly by a large event which rocks their world as they know it. The hero then initially refuses the call, scared or unwilling to partake in the adventure, or in some instances, like that of Psyche, who faces a large depression from having to live without seeing her divine husband, they wish to simply refuse the heroic life they are being offered. However, soon after they meet the mentor, who in myth was often the oracle, but could also be a wise elder or past hero who gives them advice or a pep talk and encourages them to partake on their journey. Afterwards, the hero then leaves their familiar world and crosses the threshold into their adventure, leading to the beginning of the second act. The hero will face a few small challenges, meet allies, and make enemies as their journey begins. Before long, though, the hero then approaches the innermost cave, creeping towards their greatest ordeal yet. The ordeal is typically the mid-story climax, where the hero faces off against a challenge that pushes them to their limits, tests their skills, and maybe injures/kills them or their allies. Either way, the hero gets through it and seizes the reward for their victory. Not all may be happy, however, as this is the moment where the hero may attempt to tread the road back home. The reasons vary from hero to hero, but they may either believe their journey to be done, or attempt to give up entirely. However, after some time, the hero then finds themselves wrapped back up in their conflict. And soon enough, the hero is either resurrected or faces atonement of some kind, deciding to rejoin the adventure and finish it properly. This is the climax of the myth, which after the final threat is destroyed and the final test passed, the hero is allowed to properly return to their normal world with the elixir. In a literal sense, holding the spoils of their journey, but metaphorically having been changed from their outing. Heracles' capture of Kerberos proves that he is of godly status, and after returning with the beast, he is granted the respect and honor he wanted amongst his peers. It's important to note that not every detail of every step needs to be taken literally. Indeed, many of these steps only fit vaguely into different myths because the story itself isn't a literal adventure. Yet Campbell had a point. There was a definite structure here, and one that evidently worked when used in writing. So, those proficient in prose and poetry began to incorporate them, which takes us to the dawn of epics. Achilles in the Iliad follows the journey much like many mythical heroes of the past. Starting out as just a soldier in the Greek armed forces, he is soon called to adventure in the war against Troy. Remember that Achilles initially refuses to join because Agamemnon took away his concubine. Yes, this is his refusal reason. Odysseus convinces him otherwise though, and soon he departs for Troy. From this point onward, it becomes clear just how many pieces of the story fall into Campbell's observed structure. Achilles goes through his ordeal and loss, that being of his friend Patroclus, and ultimately, Achilles has a very unique return and resurrection when he decides to return Hector's body to King Priam. He may be reluctant to, but he makes some semblance of atonement this way and is able to end his journey on a bittersweet note. Well, until, you know. Of course, Homer went on to influence, like, literally everyone on the planet, so while the hero's journey in ancient myth might have been the basic skeletal structure of storytelling, the epic became the musculature which drove the plot forward and molded many more tales to come. First, while myth was considered real, as each story was of religious significance to the people of the time, epics were actually always meant to be sort of real stories. Often they were based on real-world events, and they told tall tales of heroism based on them. With the rarity of written stories in general literacy for centuries, it makes sense that historical, and easy to retell orally, stories became much more popular. The Trojan War and its fallout was very very real, but there's little to no evidence that Achilles, Helen of Troy, Odysseus, or other future fanfic characters like Aeneas were real people. And such authors like Virgil interpreted the past to paint favorable images of past heroism within their culture. This continued throughout history in stories such as Beowulf, where the titular character helps King Hrothgar of the Danes to fight off demonic creatures like Grendel, Grendel's mother, and then later on his own, a dragon. Now, of course, Grendel is definitely not real, big surprise, but whether Hrothgar himself is real or not, his story is indeed based in history and some kind of real legendary king. Additionally, one thing these stories kept from myth was a reliance on the supernatural. Indeed, epics have their own specific set of rules they introduced to future tales to come. The vast majority of epic protagonists call upon otherworldly forces to aid in their journey. Think of Homer and Virgil, where both Odysseus and his lame clone Aeneas travel to the underworld to try and learn something about their journey. Similarly, many epic heroes are nigh, and they do things no ordinary person would do, facing challenges far beyond the average person's adversities. Achilles, though never stated to have a weakness in his heel in the Iliad itself, this was a later addition to the story, is extraordinarily strong. His combat ability and how much he does for the Greeks clearly displays his godly heritage. Moving forward to Beowulf again, the guy defeats most of his foes with his bare hands. Even when he tries to use a sword against Grendel's mother, it is ineffective, with his sheer strength being the thing which helps him actually take her down. Speaking of Beowulf, though, it is from this point onward where the specific steps of the journey become more unclear amongst popular stories. Beowulf does follow the journey to a near-perfect degree, being called to adventure in a strange land, facing Grendel's mother as his ordeal, and facing atonement in the battle against the dragon. But most importantly, he does not refuse the call. On the contrary, Beowulf is way more willing to endure the journey than most others. He does experience challenges, yes, but it does little to discourage him from continuing the fight. The initial or continuous doubt of the hero used to be a constant, but this dissipates as time goes on. Not entirely, because, well, if you've read Inferno, you know Dante doesn't like going through hell, but for the most part. The vast majority of heroes had been masculine figures, but by the Dark Ages, overtly masculine and selfless characters became much the norm. While epics are no longer the most popular stories penned, quite a few pieces of media are considered of epic proportions, and still take from Campbell's observed structure. Tolkien's The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings trilogy both follow the original structure of the hero's journey. Let's talk about The Hobbit. Bilbo lives his ordinary life and is called by Gandalf to adventure. Bilbo is a coward and refuses, but then Gandalf returns as more of a mentor this time. He starts his adventure, crossing into the unfamiliar world outside of the Shire, meeting new allies and enemies. He then approaches Smaug's lair and eventually faces him alone. The Arkenstone serves as Bilbo's reward for driving Smaug out, and he begins his road back until the Battle of Five Armies serves as his last roadblock. Here, Bilbo has his worldviews and choices validated and is metaphorically resurrected. Finally, after the battle's end, Bilbo returns home. His journey clearly pulls from several aspects of epics as well. Gandalf and his wizardry, as well as the great wonders of Middle-earth, are indeed of supernatural proportions. Sting is literally a magic glowing sword, and along his journey he picks up, well, you know what he picks up. While Middle-earth is just a generally magical setting all around, Bilbo is not familiar with much of it and ends up learning to rely on the wonders around him. Something similar to the structure of epics like Beowulf or the Odyssey. Something interesting I want to mention that was in the blog post I referenced, which broke down The Hobbit into steps of the hero's journey. I've read The Hobbit, I just needed the clarification. Is a note which states that the hero's journey centers around the idea of change. I stated earlier that every hero who follows the journey experiences change of some sort, but it's easy to understand why. The journey is not a familiar thing to any of these heroes. It is a completely new experience which entirely changes their lives. Bilbo never wanted to adventure, but in the end he found himself to be a little hero. And think about Luke Skywalker in Star Wars as well. Luke was just some farm boy from Tatooine. Only after he meets Obi-Wan and learns about his father's past does he even get a taste of the Jedi life, which he is suddenly thrust into when his aunt and uncle are mercilessly murdered by the Empire. Luke is an entirely different person with a different life by the end. I mean, heck, if you know about the cut content with his old friend Biggs Darklighter, you know that he also loses the one person he had left from Tatooine to Darth Vader. Yes, he follows the steps to a pretty rigid and formulaic degree. Yes, he ends up learning of a supernatural world with the Force that he didn't know about, but importantly, he changed. Even as far back as Jason and Heracles, every hero faces and learns to accept change. Most of them come out better for it too. I say most because there are some oddballs out there. I mean, Breaking Bad follows the hero's journey too. Some people who follow the journey aren't exactly heroes, and Walter White definitely does not come out better person than he was before. But think of all the modern heroes who follow the traditional path to greatness. Joel from The Last of Us, Maximus of Gladiator, Neo in The Matrix, Harry Potter, Batman and the Dark Knight, Spider-Man, and even... I'm sorry for 2 of those jokes in one video. I really liked that show. Campbell's monomyth might have just been an observation and not entirely true, and not every story must follow the hero's journey to be a good tale of heroism, but it has persevered and evolved throughout the years. That must say something. So, what's the conclusion? Well, Campbell had a point, as I said, but I don't like his model all that much.
Let me tell you.